you know about the third place? The third place. There's home, there's work, and there's the third place. I grew up watching Norm, Cliff, Diane, and Sam all meet up at Cheers, a neighborhood pub in Boston, where everybody knows your name. I remember watching those Ice Cube movies centered around how the barber shop was most definitely the third place. I have a friend who says he always looks for the barber shop in every town before he could ever even think about living there. Even though he's completely bald, he needs to know there is a third place that will take him in. In the pandemic, we immediately lost our third place. Heck, most of us lost our second place, too, and became real intimate with our first place, our home. The world closed in, and there we were with our thoughts and our fears and our work obligations and our friendships and our piles of dishes and our mouths to feed and our news feed and our anxieties all laid bare in front of us, unavoidable within those four walls. You remember that, right? Even if you were living with a partner or roommate or beloved pet, it was a lonely, lonely time. Some days, I don't know how we made it through. But then I think I know exactly how we survived the strange isolation of those months that became years. How many of you can raise your hands or say it in the chat, how many of you found ways to reconnect with old friends across distance using Zoom? It was nothing short of a miracle how quickly the older generation at UUCA got with it. I mean, how so many folks, yes, applaud yourselves. So many folks who were raised and educated without this level of technology just faced that need to connect and learned to use Zoom, expert level. Meanwhile, many also rediscovered the beauty of the long-distance call. I established new rituals with old friends, monthly meetings with 8 of my closest friends who have all spread out across the globe. We reconnected often enough to become reacquainted with the daily dramas of each other's lives. And I heard of some congregants, some of you, who scheduled check-in calls with just one person a few times a week. And for the first few months, I don't know if you remember this, the lay ministers and other congregant leaders made calls to hundreds and hundreds of people on our lists, making sure everyone felt a connection in those early days of pandemic. Now, the term buddy system, have you heard of it? Was initially coined as a military term, defining that experience when at least 2 people work together as a single unit to be able to help and monitor one another. It's a procedure used in many situations, deemed considerably more dangerous for one person to do alone. All branches of the military use the buddy system in one form or another. And then there's scouts, schools, plenty of organizations, missionaries frequently engage in some sort of form of the buddy system. I'm also thinking about how when you see Mormon kids on their bikes going to door, they use the buddy system. And you have used the buddy system before. Remember when you were on a class field trip, when you returned to the bus and your buddy wasn't there, it was your responsibility to check up on them. We use this also when we go to protests, Washington, D.C., or at the Capitol. This buddy system reminds us that people can have different life journeys and still be responsible to and for each other. We must bring each other along, and that is more vital now than it ever has been. As we navigate uncharted territory, doing the spiritual work within ourselves, amongst each other, and beyond our walls, we must address the chasm of ideology and belief that marks this era of the 2020s. The buddy system applies not only to the life raft we throw to each other during our time of greatest struggle, but also to those more complicated relationships with those who we might understand as our neighbor. I want to explore the anatomy of a friendship between two young men that is kind of a roadmap for navigating some of the hardest territory of our time. You may have heard this story documented well on Krista Tippett's On Being podcast or on some other news programs a couple of years ago. Derek Black was a young man who grew up the heir apparent of a leading white nationalist family. David Duke was his godfather. His father launched the Stormfront, what do you call that website or newsletter? Matthew Stevenson, meanwhile, one of the only Orthodox Jews on this Florida college campus where they both attended at New College, decided, after Derek's ideology was outed on campus to great condemnation, Matthew decided to invite him to Shabbat dinner for 2 years. See, Derek lived downstairs from Matthew, and sometimes Matthew would sing along when Derek played country and western songs on his guitar. But nevertheless, when the news broke on campus about Derek's ideology and his family connections to white supremacy, Matthew noticed many people on campus began treating Derek very poorly, trying to make his life as miserable as possible, and what he thinks was an attempt to change the situation. Meanwhile, Matthew had been hosting these Shabbat dinners in his dorm, his little apartment, every Friday night, along with his good friend, Moshe Ash. They spoke about it, and they decided here was an opportunity. They knew that Derek had grown up in a white nationalist family, among white nationalist royalty, so to speak, and they felt that he probably did not personally know any people from the backgrounds that his ideology despised. And so for that reason, Matthew and Moshe invited Derek to come over for Shabbat dinner. The first time that Derek was invited over, Matthew was very explicit that with all the people at his dinner that this was not ambush Derek time. This was not some opportunity to yell at him for the wrongness of his beliefs, because Matthew knew Derek had spent his whole life defending his ideology. Matthew had not spent his whole life attacking the statistics and other things that they build their ideological convictions on, and so he knew that shouting at him would just immediately put him on the defensive, and he would never come back. So he was explicit that people were not to discuss his background at the table, or the white nationalism more generally. Now Derek admitted that he was less worried about being grilled than he was about what actually happened, which is that he simply ended up spending years of really enjoyable time among people who the fact that he was friends with them was just contradictory to his entire worldview. And that was a lot more uncomfortable than if he had been grilled, because he had a background doing media interviews since he was 12 years old, where people would say to him, sometimes on camera, "How do you believe in hate?" And he came with crime statistics and IQ statistics and a history of American white supremacist statements from the founding fathers to back up his arguments. And he was pretty comfortable with that position. He thought it was important. He knew how to do it, and if it had been a big argument, well, he would have arrived that day with his arsenal of statistics. He would have misused social science, and no one would have been changed at all. But instead, they would have been further planted in their separate ideologies. Instead, the very real thing that he feared did come to pass. but simply that Derek was just at a Shabbat dinner for 2 years. And eventually, he had to say to himself, well, I think my beliefs are very anti-Semitic. And I do like this dinner. And I do love these people. So after 2 years of Shabbat dinners, Derek Black published a public letter denouncing the white nationalist ideology which alienated him from his family of origin and the friends he had known his whole life. And he wrote an article about it for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Derek credits not only the weekly Shabbat dinners and the relationships he formed there, but also the outrage, the public condemnation that led him to attend the dinners in the first place. See, this is important. It's really a problem if the story gets told as just a piece of evidence that the only way you change people's minds is by having friendly conversations with them. But that's not really the whole truth. It is essential that you speak up loudly. This is what Derek says now. It is essential that you speak up loudly and you do condemn a belief that is wrong, publicly, fiercely. That is what happened at New College in Florida. The context for those Shabbat dinners, for those conversations, was an entire community of people who Derek had respected, people who had known him before they knew about his background. Well, they had all clearly come to an intelligent conclusion that what he was advocating for was morally and factually wrong. And that gave him a lot of pause. That made him wonder if perhaps he was wrong. And so Derek contends that both the public outrage and the intimate relationship building were both essential. And I keep returning to Matthew, who hosted these Shabbat dinners. I mean, how could he invite Derek over to his home, to his sanctuary? Matthew makes the point that even an ideology which is as reprehensible as it was to him, as it probably is to every one of us in this room, as we all believe white nationalism to be, once you cross that line saying he's forfeited his rights as a human being, he's forfeited his right to human dignity by virtue of having those beliefs, Matthew thinks, well, maybe the Nazis said that the Jews forfeited their rights to human dignity by virtue of being Jews. Where does it end? So, be strong, yes. Be clear in your convictions, no question. Be public about it. But there is a difference between being strong and violating the humanity of another person. And so both Derek and Matthew are clear that it is both the public outrage and condemnation that is necessary, coupled with the more intimate outreach and long-term engagement. The buddy system. Now, much about this story might seem unique or impossible even, but I stake my faith on stories like this one. I see this story of Derek and Matthew not as idyllic or idealist, but as strategic. Through relationship, all things are possible. Through relationship, all things are possible. Do you believe it? Now, I was raised a Girl Scout, and I remember, leave no one behind. And I think this is how the world transforms into a more peaceful, equitable place, both out in the public square and at the dinner table. And on this Labor Day weekend, I would like to lift up one other part of this story, which is about the container of Shabbat. Shabbat is where these conversations, this dialogue, and this relationship flourished. Shabbat, a full day of rest. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote extensively about the practice of Shabbat, believed the higher goal of spiritual living is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. In a religious experience, for example, it is not a thing that imposes itself on us humans. It is a spiritual presence we can become aware of, we can attune to. What is retained in the soul is the moment of insight. A moment of insight is a fortune, transporting us beyond the confines of measured time. The dinner table. The dinner table is a place where we can face a sacred moment and come away with that moment of insight. With no specific goal in mind, Matthew Stevenson invited Derek Black to Shabbat dinner. And with no specific goal in mind, Derek Black showed up to dinner. I imagine there were candles. I imagine there was home cooking. I imagine there was wine at the table and long, languishing discussions of religion and ideas that led to emotional connection until they could no longer maintain that it was better to be right than to be liked by their neighbor. It was the time out of time, not tending to work or schoolwork, but to relationship. That's what gave them the insight needed to realize that it was better to be liked and to like yourself than to be right. Tending to our relationships, the ones that challenge us, the ones that keep us connected to another world, another perspective, those relationships bring out a side in us like nobody else. And Labor Day is about seeing the human in front of you as you are. As truly human, just as you are. I mean, really, it's about the corporate leaders seeing the people who work for them as truly human as they are. But I think we can extend that to everyone's humanity. So on this Labor Day, as teachers are under attack and expected to endure worsening job conditions, as fascism lurks ever closer to our most central political systems, as civil rights remain under constant attack everywhere, leaving entire cities without potable water in Mississippi. Come on. We've got to remember the buddy system. Leave no one behind. I think UUCA can be your third place. I think that UUCA can be your dining room table. This can be the place, and these can be the people with whom you practice Sabbath, where you face sacred moments, remembering that truth that sets us all free, that nobody can make it out here alone, and nobody has to.